Hey everybody, it's me, Dr. Amanda Kemp. Today I want to talk with you about something I'm calling my fragility, race trauma, and coming back to wholeness. Last week I shared with you my interpretation of Robin DiAngelo's white fragility. Gave you some tools for what to do when you're in the presence of someone who's experiencing white fragility and racial stress. One of the important things about that piece is it had me thinking about my own fragility. What's it like for Black people, and particularly Black women, when we are under racial stress? Because for me, this journey is not all about, oh, I have it all together and let me tell you. This journey is about what I'm learning about me, keeping myself awake to how I have internalized mechanisms like white supremacy that keep me separated from myself. Because what I'm interested in, what I'm committed to is my liberation. And I'm committed to wholeness and oneness amongst all people. And to do that authentically, we of course have to recognize how these systems are working inside of us and how we are playing them out ourselves. For those of you who don't know me yet, I'm Dr. Amanda Kemp, and I'm the author of Say the Wrong Thing, Stories and Strategies for Racial Justice. I'm currently teaching a class here right now in Lancaster based on my book. I'm teaching people my heart system for racial justice. A couple of weeks ago, I had the honor of attending a Deeper Change forum sponsored in New Haven featuring Ricardo Levins Morales. He's a Puerto Rican political artist, longtime organizer, born in Puerto Rico and then migrated to Chicago at the young age of 11 in the late 60s. And so Ricardo just had tons of pearls of wisdom, one of which I want to share with you. He said, liberation is about coming back to ourselves and coming back to wholeness. Liberation isn't necessarily about ceasing to oppress you. And it isn't necessarily just about systems changing. It's about our relationships to ourselves changing and our division amongst each other changing, which is why I love the quote from Ricardo. Liberation is about coming back to ourselves and coming back to wholeness. So when I think about my own fragility, the signs of my racial stress going into overload. So Ricardo was quoting someone who said that, she called it allostatic. It's like when things get combined. So it's just not like one person makes a comment or makes an assumption about me that makes me, takes my racial stress into overload. It's when there's been a bunch of stuff adding up. Deborah King, a Black sociologist, she would say that it's not racial oppression plus class oppression plus gender oppression. She says it's not plus, it's actually times. So these systems compound. And so there is a lot of stress that we live under the more that we are marginalized by this system. Our gender expression, our class position, race, obviously, as I've said, and sexualities. So if we look at these things as compounding, as Deborah King would argue, then we're under a lot of stress a lot of the time. And as maybe Black women or women of color, we get used to the stress. We're conditioned to it in a way that Robin DiAngelo says that white people aren't and white women aren't, because of how the system protects them, how whiteness protects them from racial stress. So, but I was thinking about how we're still fragile. On Facebook, there was a phrase with a beautiful image going around saying that as a Black woman, I'm tired of being strong. I want to be vulnerable. And this whole image, this whole expectation that we are strong, that we can take whatever you dish out at us and we're going to still I rise, like Maya Angelou said, right? Or Mari Evans, the poet, wrote a poem called I Am the Black Woman. She's like, like a tree, tall, strong. I cannot be overcome. And this is true. And
we are also overcome sometimes. We are also heartbroken and feel broken inside emotionally. And I think it's so important, especially for Black women finding wholeness, that we pay attention to our racial stress, that we notice when we're going into overload, and we take care of ourselves. Because if we don't, then we, of course, are going to be looking for those around us to do different than they are doing. And we may find ourselves really disappointed in each other, disappointed in our partners, whether they're our love partners or our partners in the struggle. So I want to go more into this. I want to talk about a couple examples. So I mentor people. I mentor and coach people who are committed to racial justice from different backgrounds. And I teach. And I've had experiences with Black women, older than me and younger than me, where I want to tell you what this racial overload looks like, where I see our fragility. I have seen it in, for example, there was one Black woman who just didn't want to talk about race. Like, she was part of a multiracial group or a predominantly white group, and she didn't want the group to discuss race because she felt so vulnerable, like she would lose her individuality if this group somehow tried to take on and acknowledge its privilege. She didn't want to have the group delve into racial stress. So she was already at her maximum, and she did not want to go any further. So you may know someone like this. So this may be you, I have to say that where I connected with this particular person was not wanting to deal with white guilt. So when I was first getting together with my husband, who's my partner, I was a little hesitant about him really delving into white privilege a lot, because I didn't want to have to be around his guilt, which is what I think when you delve into racism, ultimately if you're white, you're ultimately going to come face to face with, wow, this family is sick, and I have been and if America is a dysfunctional child, then white people have been like the favorite child in a very sick system, which has been abusing other children, so they're going to feel some guilt. So anyway, that's one reaction, is to be like, no, don't talk about race around these white people, because then I'm going to feel uncomfortable and have to deal with their guilt and anguish. And, I just rather focus on whatever it is we have in common. Another example of I'll call it Black fragility is when you have someone Black, let's say, working in a workplace where like they're the only Black person. And I can say I've also been this person, and it is hard. You'll see in a blog I'm going to publish very soon, I write about being 23 and crying in a bathroom at my job. At that time I was working in a predominantly white liberal theater company. It was like, a very prestigious company. It was supposed to be part of setting me up to have success as a theater professional. So I had this internship, and I found their attitudes, their assumptions so unconsciously biased and racist that, and I felt so alone because they couldn't see it in themselves. And so anyway, one day after one meeting about looking at some plays, I just went to the bathroom and I cried and I cried. And recently I met someone else who at, her job, similar situation, so isolated, people so unaware of their racism, so unaware of the way that they automatically dismiss her contributions. her intelligence, her expertise, that kind of stress builds up. And what's important about it, what I want us to notice about it, is when we get to a situation where all we have is our tears and this anguish inside of us, then it's compounded racial stress. It's not just this moment or that meeting where somebody disregarded what you said or dismissed or, wouldn't let you finish your point or what have you. It's the accumulation of that stress. So what I want us to be conscious of is, how does this particular moment of where I'm feeling so much flooding of feelings, like, how does it connect with something else in my personal biography of the feeling of being worthless, of being the least favorite child, if in your family you felt that a lot, or the forgotten one, or the one that everybody teased, or it could be something else in your biography. It could be that, it could relate to all kinds of other trauma in your personal family. So anyway, I wanted to raise up that whole experience of when you're alone, when you're the only one at a job, and there's this repeated kind of way in which you get pigeonholed or disrespected or disregarded. You can have a moment of just flooding, and at any age. I was only 23 when it happened to me, and someone else I know was a bit older, and we have to deal with it. And then the other type of reaction I've seen in terms of seeing Black fragility is when, like, we're so angry when this one comment that somebody made, or a decision, it doesn't even have to necessarily be that important, but it just unleashes all the fury that we have about our powerlessness onto that particular instance. And I've seen it where people are like, wow, why is she so angry? How did this trigger that reaction? It seems a little bit over the top for what the situation was. And what I want to say is about that is that it's not that your anger or our anger is wrong. It's that it's accumulated. And then all we have is this kind of rush of anger. I mean, I've done it. And we're on the attack because ultimately we feel like we got to defend ourselves. We're attacking because we feel so attacked. And we can't, and we're not in the present moment, but we're in a rush of anger. So these are all examples I'm giving you of what I'm going to call when our trauma, our accumulated trauma, gets triggered into a flood of feelings where we no longer have choice in the matter, where we are overwhelmed. So I'm calling this, in this case, I'm calling this Black fragility, because I wanted to give it a name so you can see how it is coming out of our vulnerability. I want us to start acknowledging how vulnerable and tender we are. We're not just strong. I wanted to give you what to do when you're in the presence of my fragility. When I'm in the presence of my fragility. First of all, when I'm at that overload point, I need to get to that strategy that I call express yourself to connect. And that's the second strategy in my heart system. When I'm noticing the flooding, or the numbness, that's the other thing. So they're overwhelmed by the feelings of all of a sudden feeling like I have no feelings at all. The numbness, which is another form of overload. When I'm noticing that, the strategy I recommend to you is that you express yourself to connect with your body and your feelings. My heart system, that's the letter E. And usually when we think of express yourself, we're thinking about, oh, tell somebody. And that is valid, but I don't want that to be your first step of expression. The first step of expression is to express, to connect more deeply to yourself. Because inevitably, when we are in racial stress overload, it's because someone or something has not honored us, where we have been disregarded, dismissed, or harmed in some way. And so by expressing yourself to connect more deeply to your feelings, you begin to pay attention to yourself. You honor yourself. In my case, after the killing of Sandra Bland, I went numb, got overwhelmed. I was filled up to here. And I didn't notice it until I just couldn't feel anything, even with people who I love. And then I got uncomfortable. I was like, oh, wow, I'm not feeling anything. The expression that I chose was to write a poem. And it didn't start off like, oh, let me make this poem that I'm going to erase every line and, really work on. No, it was just like a heartfelt expression. And for me, it came out poetically. And as I wrote, I cried because I was grieving. I was grieving for Sandra Bland. I was grieving for her mother. I was thinking about me, on my way to my first job in my 20s, and I get stopped for a traffic stop. And next thing I know, I'm dead. Your parents get a call. There you are about to start a new job, and then you get a call saying, she's dead. The grief about that, and the anger of the unfairness of it, and my fear for myself and my family. So that poem, which is called Say Her Name, came from that. And that helped me to come back into myself, come back into my feelings and my body. Because ultimately, like Ricardo said, liberation isn't going to come from separation. Liberation is going to come back from reconnecting with our whole selves, which is our body and our emotions, in addition to our minds and the intellect. And we know, if you've read white supremacy culture, or even if you haven't, maybe you have an instinctual understanding that the way this society tends to separate mind and body and tends to elevate the mind over the body and over the feelings, it's all in that whole separation ideology. So that's what I want to say to when we get overwhelmed with racial stress, is we don't have to, but my invitation to you is to express yourself, to connect more deeply with your feelings and your body. I do it through poetry. You could do it through anything else that works for you. Movement, free writing, a letter to God, writing in your journal, writing to an ancestor, praying out loud to the divine. And ultimately, I did share my poem with someone who I'm very close to. I trusted to hear that poem. And I cried as I read it aloud. I actually recorded it. I read it aloud and I recorded it because I wanted to honor those feelings in that moment. So now, if you are not Black and you are in the presence of Black fragility, I encourage you to use the strategy of holding space for transformation. So in my course, when I talk about what that is with people, I say it's adopting a mindset or a spirit of unconditional love and unconditional acceptance. So if you, for example, are the person who just happened to say that one thing that created the allostatic overload, racial stress, and maybe, it really wasn't what you said, but you just happen to be the white person in the space when it happened. I encourage you to hold space for transformation, to just hold this space of unconditional love and unconditional acceptance, if you can, to not defend, not to try to reason somebody out of their feelings. That's really going to make people mad. Don't try to solve it and, rescue, which will also kind of make people mad. It's really just be super present and in your breath. Super present and in your breath, because what you're doing is you're giving the gift of your heart. That's what holding space for transformation is. So, and I don't know, well, let me put it this way. I do know what it feels like to be in the space of someone who's just venting, and I just happen to be there, and I know it's hard. I want to say it's hot. It's a hot spot to be in. But one of the wonderful ways to increase your capacity to be a transformation agent is to hold space for transformation in the midst of someone's upset, in the midst of someone's rage or someone's tears or what have you. If you feel unsafe, then I think it's important to take care of yourself and to remove yourself. If you can't hold the space, then I think it's important to remove yourself. So I hope this has been a helpful conversation for you about what I'm calling my fragility, about the reaction to the overload of racial stress and the ways in which we carry that, and then what you can do about it. So, and I just want to say that it's my honor to share with you the strategies that have come out of my lived experience and what I have been taught by others who've gone before me. So I mentioned Ricardo Levins Morales, who you can find online, of course, he's an artist, and he'll be at Pendle Hill in May for a conference on democracy and power. I also want to acknowledge Neonu Span, who taught me the whole idea of holding space for transformation, because I didn't have it as a tool before she articulated it and gave me lots of opportunities to practice. If this is kind of working for you, want to know more, please, you can check out my book, Say the Wrong Thing, where I tell stories from my own life about it. But I'm also really happy and excited to be teaching a class this summer online that will have a coaching component. I invite you to check that out. It's going to be on my website. You can email me about it, again, via my website. Brad mentioned that coming out of our transracial family. And I just want to acknowledge that, yeah, these interracial and transracial families are great spaces to be really self-aware, to practice self-awareness. As adults in these families, we don't want to harm our children, and we want to provide a model for our children. I encourage you, when you get to that point of racial stress overload, that you tend to yourself. And if you're in the space of someone who's going through overload inside your family, that you practice holding space for transformation. In our class next week, we're going to be talking about the strategy Act with Intention. That's the A in the heart system. I look forward to sharing with you about that next week. Peace and love, everybody.